Bixby. I'm the senior pastor here at First of our entire congregation and our green team. We're delighted that you are here for our keynote and panel and this wonderful morning of recommitting ourselves to the work of being good stewards of God's creation. If there's any way myself or anyone here at the church can make you feel warmly welcomed, please just let us know. I don't know if Sarah's going to cover this, but restrooms are out through the door you came through and then go through that double door, or accessible restrooms are through the interior door here, and they do have buttons on them for anyone who needs assistance. So it feels appropriate that we would gather with a prayer, so would you please pray with me? Creator, sustainer, one who loves all of us and all this world into being. We gather as your people, formed in your image and aware of our interconnectedness with all of creation, from the soil beneath our toes to the stars twinkling above our heads. We give thanks for every single person here. We give thanks for Reverend Brooks being with us for our panel. We give thanks for our green team and our covenant to walk with all of creation and humbly with you. We ask for your blessing. We ask that you would open our minds, our hearts, and whole lives to get caught up in your still creating presence here and now and every day. All this we pray in your name. Amen. So it is a privilege for me to introduce the chair of our Green Initiative, Reverend Dr. Sarah Melcher.
Thanks to Pastor Wes for supporting us in this, and he has helped us every step of the way to get this organized. I wanted to talk a little bit about the schedule this morning. So first we're going to hear from Reverend Brooks Berndt for the keynote address, and you'll have time for questions and answers after that. So if a question comes to your mind, be ready. I'll be running around with a microphone and you'll get your chance. And then we're going to have a break. And then a panel discussion. And we have 3 local people who are experts on climate change and what to do about it. Jean Doobie is here from the Sarasota Audubon Society, the president of that organization. And Dr. Frank Alcock is here from New College, and this church was instrumental in founding New College. I don't know if you knew that, but so we are very proud of New College, and we stand with them at this difficult time. And we're just grateful that Dr. Frank Alcock, who is the professor of political science and environmental studies, that he's here with us. And then Jerry Larson, coming to us from Punta Gorda, who was instrumental in getting the United Congregational Church of Congregational UCC. I got it. Okay. Of Punta Gorda. He was instrumental in getting them to adopt solar power. So we're grateful that all of these people could join us today. It's wonderful. I want to first introduce you to Reverend Brooks Berndt. He is the United Church of Christ's Environmental Justice Minister. He is the author of the recent book, Cathedral on Fire, a church handbook for the climate crisis. And by the way, there are books for sale in the narthex. The book emphasizes the gifts that churches can bring to address the environmental crisis, while it provides practical steps that churches can take. This book lit a fire under me to try to take some meaningful action, and hence this conference came about. As the Minister for Environmental Justice, Brooks led the UCC to issue a report in 2020 entitled Breath to the People, Sacred Air and Toxic Pollution. The report identifies 100 super polluters and how they threaten communities. Brooks writes and edits an environmental newsletter called The Pollinator, opportunity to sign up to receive the pollinator, if you wish, in the back of the church. And he co-hosts Creation Justice webinars each month, and they're very interesting. During Brooks' tenure at the National UCC, the denomination received a Climate Leadership Award from Eco-America, and the World Council of Churches nominated the UCC's Environmental Justice Program for a UN prize. And the American Climate Leadership Summit awarded $10,000 to the UCC's Environmental Justice Program and the People's Justice Council as a finalist for the 2021 American Climate Leadership Award. Brooks also helped First Congregational and Barbara Smith Bacon as we made application to be a Creation Justice Church, which we are. So please join me in welcoming our keynote speaker for today, Reverend Brooks Berndt.
Well, it is great to be here. I was glad that I arrived yesterday before the sun set, so that Sarah and Elaine could take me to see New Palace, beautiful campus, and to see the water and the bay and so forth. And after a couple hours, I was making plans to move my family here. They don't know about the plans yet, but yeah, it's a beautiful place, and I'm just delighted to be able to get to know members of this community, to spend some time with you. And I do want to say special thanks to your Church's Green Team initiative. Your Creation Justice Church application was easily one of the best I've ever read. It was great. You guys put a lot of terrific work into that. So delighted to be with you all today. There is a sense in which I feel like coming to Florida is a bit like coming to ground zero in climate change. I assume that if you're coming here on a Saturday morning to talk about climate hope, you know that there's some reasons for despair, so I won't go too much into it, but every day I read the national and international newspapers, and it's not too often, it is with more frequency than probably you would like, just that I see Florida in the headlines when it comes to climate change. You want to hear some of those headlines, or you're like, no, we've heard those headlines enough. But I'll give you one example. Florida wasn't in the title, but this past week it was inferred in the title, or implied in the title, where U.S. house prices may be most overvalued as climate change worsens. And the where is here, right? It's estimated that just in flooding alone, houses in Florida are overvalued by $50 billion. And one of the points of the article I kind of took home from that, I often view Florida as a canary in the coal mine, is that it's not just bad news for homeowners, it's bad news for entire communities, because as housing values go down, tax revenues go down, schools suffer, and so on and so forth. And so, dealing with very, very difficult issues that indeed are cause for a sane person, for despair, I believe. And so I believe that sometimes it helps to kind of look to places and to pick up stories from places that have found hope in some of the worst of times. So I want to begin this morning with a story that it may at first seem like a far cry from my addressing contagious hope and the climate crisis, but I think if you stick with me, you'll find that it's a fitting metaphor to ground us for today. Last year, an award-winning journalist named Sarah Topol visited Ukraine to spend time with a vast community whose members have come to be known as the Iron People. They are the railway workers who have become the nation's heroes for their work in operating 15,000 miles of rails that have served as a lifeline for countless evacuees in a country where millions have been displaced. Early on, the executive leaders of the rail system determined that they would immediately change the fundamental objectives and purposes of their entire institution to become a massive humanitarian operation. To begin with, they would provide a free, ticketless evacuation service that would transport as many people as possible in each rail car. Luxury sleeper cars that typically held a maximum of 18 people suddenly held 150. Second-class cars that once held 54 people carried as many as 500 people. Once evacuees were dropped off at their destination, the returning trains became the means by which tons of food and cargo, along with millions of parcels of mail, were transported back. The railways became the essential backbone for a country quickly thrust into war. Moreover, the rail system did more than serve as a means of transportation for people and goods. It became a nation's system for providing food, shelter, first aid, and even trauma counseling for a public in desperate need. Even before the war, the railway system served as a kind of social glue in an impoverished country in which people of different backgrounds, languages, and financial means came together on trains and developed a sense of common belonging and humanity. With the war, the sense of community intensified on these trains. Life in the trains for evacuees, Topol observed that while they were on those trains, they constructed their own understandings of the war in this small tin tube of safety amid the chaos outside. Trains that had always offered a comforting rhythm and warmth during the war, they came to be a kind of home after so many evacuations and after so many deaths. For both passengers and railway workers, the trains served essential roles. For employees who had lost almost everything, they provided something particularly vital, a way to help others. Trains became not only physical lifelines, but also lifelines of meaning and purpose. More than that even, they became lifelines of hope. In witnessing the railway system at work, Topol was not a detached observer. During World War II, her grandmother was 23 years old when she boarded a train in Kiev to escape becoming Nazis. The rest of her family was killed. And Topol grew up knowing that her very life was made possible because of the small fortune of a train ride to safety. From this vantage point, Topol observes how current rail employees were saving generations, people they would never meet. In forming a lifeline of hope, they were forming a lifeline of exponentially expanding consequences. Now, Topol's story is an inspiration in itself. And for me, it additionally suggests a way to reframe how I think about the role of churches today in facing the climate crisis. I realize not everyone here today may be a churchgoer, but I think some of what I have to say about churches likely translates into other faith and organizational contexts. In the age of bowling alone, studies would suggest that many faith communities and civic organizations face similar situations as they consider their institutional future and purposes. The shrinking of membership numbers has become a dominant narrative for many institutions today. With all the concern in churches over declining numbers, the Christian tradition would seem to be a slowly sinking Titanic. But what if we thought of ourselves as being saved by a lifeline in the very act of serving as a lifeline? A larger lifeline of hope when it comes to our society confronting the climate crisis. The story of Ukraine's rail system says something about how circumstances and our responses to those circumstances can completely redefine an institution. This is why I've come to believe that how churches respond to the climate crisis could very well spell the means of our own salvation. I by no means want to suggest that there have not been churches actively responding to the climate crisis already. Churches such as this one have been terrific in their response. At the same time, I believe the breadth and depth of how much churches will themselves be potentially transformed by the climate crisis still remains to be seen. Will people one day look back on faith communities in this country as heroes, as places that represented a kind of social glue, bringing diverse people together, as places that served as hubs for people doing all that they could to help their communities, as places that gave people a deep sense of belonging, of meaning and purpose right when they needed it most? If we are to become lifelines of hope, it will require institutional change, but at the same time, a rootedness in the best of our theological traditions. There's a theological tradition in the Christian faith that points to lifelines of hope in times of crisis. We might call this tradition the kairos tradition. Kairos is the Greek word that it appears over and over again in the New Testament to refer to a moment when just the right action takes place at just the right time. The coming of Jesus was a kairos moment. His coming represented the fullness of time. A famous theologian named Paul Tillich, in the midst of World War I, picked up on this word kairos as he was coming to terms with his context. He knows that the kairos moments in the Bible are God-charged moments that came amidst times of crisis, and that these moments paradoxically were moments of unique opportunity. They're moments in which suddenly a lifeline appears. During the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, a group of laity and clergy came together during a particularly difficult and violent time of crisis and reflected upon what God was doing in that moment, as they issued a famous theological statement called the Kairos document. It emphasized Kairos moments as ones in which there's a decisive call to action and one is forced to take a side. One can't sit on the fence. In the midst of crisis, Christians in South Africa found a sense of meaning and purpose that sustained and carried them while propelling a movement forward. Today we can respond to the climate crisis in a way that also gives strength to a movement that extends a lifeline of hope. It's such a movement that could ultimately save generations to come and have exponentially expanding consequences. In Ukraine, the leaders of the railway system made a choice in a moment of crisis. As the war was just beginning, rumors were swirling about the Russian army and their weapons as they amassed along the border. Anxiety was high, panic was setting in. It was in that moment that a 38-year-old chief executive of the rail system, named Alexander Commission, sent a message to the leaders of his organization. He showed a picture of himself in his apartment in central Kiev as he tucked into bed his 8 and 12-year-old sons. Soon the head of passenger services replied with a photo of his toddler at bath time. The photos were a message. They were a statement of their commitment to staying, of their commitment to do what that moment called for. What we do in the midst of the climate crisis starts with how we respond to God's call. I believe that often our sense of call is rooted in love. If I were to express that love to you in a photo, it would be a photo of my 7 and 11-year-old daughters. When we're tuned into our calling, I don't think we sit around and say, woe is me, the situation is awful, and there's nothing I can do. Instead, we're propelled by a relentless determination. We search and we look for an answer, we stretch and we reach out for something to grab onto. We reach until finally our hands grab a hold of something, a lifeline of hope, a lifeline that we grab not only to save ourselves, but a lifeline that we grab to save those we love. If we think of churches, faith communities, as places where we are often grabbing and extending and throwing lifelines, I want to invite you to learn from your own experiences with lifelines. Think of the times you have either grabbed or extended lifelines. What happened? Each of us has some wisdom and gained from experiences that's relevant to what we're facing today. This past year, I began keeping a document on my computer that I titled Hope Journal, with the idea that the reflective process itself would help me place my hands on a lifeline. It did indeed do that, and I'm not expecting my journal observations to be universally applicable, but I'll share some of them with you in case they should stimulate your own thoughts and reflections. A key insight for me was to frame the matter of climate despair and hope as not simply two opposing states of being, but as two poles on a continuum. A broad swath of that continuum I would categorize with the descriptor coping. Most of my everyday life is filled with neither tearful despair nor exuberant hope, but some form of coping that's tinged with a bit of hope or a bit of despair, depending on what I'm facing or doing in that moment. And to see myself as being on a continuum keeps me from feeling perpetually stuck in climate funk. Another important part of reframing my outlook so as not to feel stuck in an emotional quagmire is to see myself as moving through stages. These stages from outright despair to a place of healthy coping and some degree of hope. Some of you may remember Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's 5 Stages of Grief. In a similar manner, I jotted down 5 stages of hope that seem to be a reoccurring pattern in my everyday life, practically. And so I'll share with you some of these stages here. I came up with some photos to go along with it. Stage 1 I call the car crash of climate doom. And the emotional turmoil that is a sane response to the climate crisis. The despair in this stage can easily become mixed with anger or strong indignation. I can find myself in a car crash whenever a new climate report comes out that details how dire our situation is. And then there's the car crash whenever a new climate disaster is wreaking havoc on part of the world. In Florida, I'm aware that we're not talking about distant matters of concern. Stage 2 I call the roadblock of frustration. It's the sense of frustration and hopelessness and not immediately seeing what can be done to remedy or mitigate the crisis. I think there's a danger that one can become permanently stuck in this stage. One can be resigned to reality as it is and permanently dejected to the point where the present crisis and unjust state of affairs becomes the normalized ground and structure of everyday life. If one's to move forward, then there has to be some more stages to come. Stage 3 I call lost without a map. I hope eventually it will get better, trust me, but stage 3, lost without a map. And in this stage, I think it was the active, persistent, even if desperate search for direction to take while coping with continued frustration. I become frustrated that there's no blueprint, pre-existing blueprint for what to do. There's no map that was created to tell me how to get from where I am to where I want to go. And I'll share a real life example later, but stage 4 though is when I think some hope begins to appear. I call this mapping with a friend. It's when the search for direction leads to others. The idea that others might have some answers represents at least a modicum sense of possibility. The others might be colleagues or friends, but they might also be storytellers, reporters, historians of movements, or writers of online resources. Gradually, with my map-making companions, an accumulated base of knowledge begins to form that allows some initial sketches of a map to be drawn. And then comes stage 5, the midway point. The journey hasn't ended and it might never end, but the mapping has led to a golden nugget of knowledge or inspiration or achievement that offers hope that allows me to continue on. Often the exhilaration of a jump forward may eventually fade a bit as I realize that we still have a ways to go and there's more questions to be answered. But what I've come to realize is the questions that lead to continued searching and learning until I get to the next breakthrough and the next leap forward. And just to give you an example, I just thought of this morning to give you a real life example. and at the same time share some information about something I hope to get you involved in. So I guess I should begin with, during kind of efforts to pass the Build Back Better legislation last year, we're experiencing a lot of frustration, and I got together with some other people and said, you know, the next time there's a chance to make something happen at the federal level, we need to be more organized. We have to have a system in place to do something in our denomination. And so we put together a plan, and that plan led to a couple of donors giving us money for to have a 2-year full-time climate justice fellow who's based in Naples, Florida. Andy Wellsbean is married to a UCC clergy person, and terrific organizer. He's organized both in faith communities and for the Sierra Club. So we brought him on board, and we planned out a year-long campaign. And I would say, you know, on a monthly basis, we're going through these five stages. And most recently, in January, we're going through these 5 stages again. And the reason was because, you know, as I mentioned, we really wanted to do something at the federal level. I'm a firm believer that if you work your way backward from the problem of the climate crisis, you have to act on the scale of the crisis. And I believe that our federal government, probably more than any institution in the world, is the best institution to act at the scale of the crisis. But if you've been watching the news, Congress isn't a real source of hope in this coming year, right? so we were back in that climate doom state, figuring out what are we going to do if it's not Congress this year. We want a fight, you know, to be engaged in a campaign that can really win something this year. We still need to engage Congress, but so we were meeting with other people, meeting with our Washington D.C. advocacy office, meeting with people from other organizations, and fortunately, a couple of leading climate organizations came out with a report that kind of for us helped us to start doing some mapping. It was a report that demonstrated a pathway for how the current Biden administration could put in motion, getting on the path to its goal of a clean energy, 100% clean energy, electrical grid in the United States by 2035. And the top thing on the list is something that's is going to be a struggle in this next year, but a struggle that we can all engage in, and it's EPA rules and regulations. That by enforcing the Clean Air Act and also actually doing some things to enforce clean water for coal plants that do coal ash pollution and water, that would put us within kind of range of achieving the 2035 goal. And so we're like, wow, this is great, a real campaign. And so that was a time when we discovering that was kind of like reaching a midway point. There is a path forward. And so in the coming months, I encourage you to invite Andy down here, or get in touch with Andy, or get a part of this climate postcard campaign. We're determining our goals now, but maybe at least 50,000 postcards we'd like to collect around the nation to send to the EPA, deliver to the EPA in person. And so that's going to be coming out in the next couple of months, and encourage you to get involved in that. But I want you to think of churches as a great place to do some mapping with friends. I think that can be a key way in which hope becomes contagious. Churches at their best are places where lifelines can be formed and extended. Churches can be that place where no one gets lost amid the rough waves of the climate crisis. I've been fortunate enough to witness some map making in action at churches. Sometimes something as simple as a book group can be a place in which some map making gets started. When I was a pastor of a church, a pivotal moment in the life of one of my members was when we read Bill McKibben's book, Earth, with 2 A's in the title. For Don's conviction to do something. And along with his wife, Alona, they became the leading climate activists in the city. In addition to rabble-rousing in the church, Don did some map making with the Sierra Club, which met in our church, and for which some of us, myself included, served as leaders. Don would become a lead organizer for some of the largest justice events of any kind that ever took place in that community. A public hearing on a coal train proposal became an event at the county fairgrounds that attracted more than 1,000 people. A hearing with the city council packed a junior college auditorium that went into the early morning hours. Don would ultimately go on to win a national award from the Sierra Club for his work. He refused to be flown to San Francisco and took the train to save on carbon emissions. Another instance of map making that I witnessed as a pastor was the decision of the congregation to do a year-long social justice campaign. We'd ultimately do at least 3 or 4 such campaigns, one on children, economic and racial justice, another on marriage equality, and one on local environmental issues. And ultimately, each time we did one of these campaigns, we faced lots of difficult questions. Where would we put our focus? Who would we work with? What kind of action would we take? Sometimes dealing with these questions kind of felt like a purgatory of sorts. But there's no going forward without wrestling with these questions. And perhaps it would be better to describe the period of intense questioning not as a purgatory, but as a wilderness. It's a wilderness that one must go through to reach the promised land. And the best way to go through the wilderness is with others. When we join with others on the journey, that's when hope becomes contagious. Let me close with one of my favorite poems because it's a poem that I feel captures what contagious hope is like. It's called The Low Road by Marge Pearson. What can they do to you? Whatever they want. They can set you up, they can bust you, they can break your fingers, they can burn your brain with electricity, blur you with drugs till you can't walk, can't remember. They can take your child, wall up your lover. They can do anything that you can't stop them from doing. How can you stop them? Alone you can fight, you can take refuse, you can refuse, you can take what revenge you can, but they'll roll over you. But 2 people fighting back to back can cut through a mob. A snake dancing file can break a cord, and an army can lead an army. 2 people can keep each other sane, can give support, conviction, love, massage, hope, sex. 3 people are a delegation, a committee, a wedge. With 4 you can play bridge and start an organization. With 6 you can rent a whole house, eat pie for dinner with no seconds, and hold a fundraising party. A dozen make a demonstration, 100 fill a hall, 1,000 have solidarity in your own newsletter, 10,000 power in your own paper, 100,000 your own media, 10 million your own country. It goes on one at a time. It starts when you care to act. It starts when you do it again and they said no. It starts when you say we and know who you mean, and each day you mean one more. Thank you.
I'm going to grab a microphone and then entertain questions from you folks. Okay, anybody want to start us off with a question? I have, do you have one? Okay, Barbara.
I'm curious, with so many issues to face, how do you pick one with your group of friends?
Yeah, I do think, because my position is environmental justice, and that I've learned that I can be asked to talk about everything from light bulbs to wildfires. There is a broad area that's covered. But one thing I can say, really thanks to to the UCC denomination is that over the years, I'm directed by resolutions our denomination passes, and we've passed a number of resolutions calling for federal action on climate change. And so for me, it gives me kind of a clear mandate to focus in that area. And as I mentioned, I think it makes a lot of sense to have that focus when faced with the climate crisis. I think it also makes sense when you're looking at things at a national level. I'll say I think, it's important to act at every level, local, state, and so forth. We need to be involved everywhere. But I do definitely think the federal, national level has to be an essential part of what's done. And so that, just that background kind of helps me think through where to focus my energies. But there are lots of places, and I think, it's also important to look to see where things intersect too. And so we're every month we do a webinar where we try to kind of address the things that people are thinking about. And so next month we'll be talking about gas and electric stoves, which has been a hot topic for some reason. So, but yeah, so it's a challenge, but I think we do all right with it.
Other questions?
Sarah? Could you comment on what may be the intersection between racial justice and environmental justice?
Yeah. I'll speak here just knowing a little bit that we have a lot of UCC audience here. So I always want to make sure every UCC church I go to knows that easily one of the top 5 most important parts of our history as a denomination is the central role that some of our leaders played in the launch of the environmental justice movement in the 1980s and 90s. The person who coined the phrase environmental racism was a UCC clergyman, Berndt, the person who led and instigated a 6-week civil disobedience campaign, which over 500 people got arrested. It was Dolly Burwell, a UCC leader. And so our history comes out of that, and that history continues to grow in its relevance with the climate crisis. And so there's any number of ways in which that becomes important. When we released our report 3 years ago now on Ash Wednesday, we released the report that Sarah mentioned on toxic air pollution. That was looking at how issues of race and class and also age intersect with the worst toxic pollution in our country. And so the worst places are definitely the places that, with the highest concentration of industries, places like Houston and Cancer Alley. And so if you go to Houston, it's largely Latinx communities along the corridor where the oil refineries are that suffer from the kind of metals going into the air that are like the airborne version of Flint, Michigan. Little kids are having heavy metals come into their bodies every day, lead, from these nearby places, which has serious impacts on brain and other life functions. So that is clearly a big intersection. It's an intersection when you think about who gets hit first and worst, who gets hit in difficulties in rebounding when a climate disaster strikes. And I also definitely encourage a global perspective. I think often, in part due to racism and to kind of the United States being very kind of not internationally minded. There's just a complete lack of awareness about how hard Africa is currently being hit. We did a webinar this past year where a young person who was a leader in the loss and damage struggle, which was a story of success at the recent UN gathering. She once woke up in the middle of the night as a young person with her bed floating in water. Right? People are living with these real life impacts, as we speak, and so there's lots of ways in which I think that intersection becomes important.
Brooks, I have a question, maybe so going back to the first question that was asked, but how much support do you find that you and your lobby group at UCC has from other faith denominations to, lobby with the federal government on some of these clearly very, very pressing issues, climate issues? And do you feel that, you're finding friends in other denominations that kind of coalesce to form a larger block to sort of push those issues for change at the federal level?
Yeah, certainly there's definitely some great leadership and things to be learned, I think, across denominations. I spent some time just a week ago with some of my colleagues as we came together in Washington, D.C. And so I always know that the Episcopalians are great when it comes to having a presence at UN climate conferences. And so I compare notes and learn what I can from them, and also look to see how we might be able to join forces at the next UN climate conference. Our Disciples of Christ, those in the United Church of Christ, now we have a close sister denomination relationship with that denomination. They have very aggressive goals about encouraging their churches to kind of be carbon negative and climate positive by 2030, and so that there seems we can learn from each other and ways in which we can look to collaborate and work together. I think organizations like Interfaith Power and Light and Green Faith and Creation Justice Ministries that do some good work and bring us together as well. So definitely, I think Interfaith Power and Light has some really good campaigns coming up in this coming year. Currently, we're partnering with them. We did a webinar actually this past week with them because one of the best things that I think faith communities can do right now is to look for ways to actually make the most of the Inflation Reduction Act. There are things in there and also in the bipartisan infrastructure legislation that faith communities can benefit from. So, with solar, faith communities for the first time ever can get a 30% direct payment from the federal government for installing solar. That's not possible until this year. Now the Department of Energy has a $50 billion grant program to give money to nonprofits for energy efficiency. So really the best thing we can do to kind of speed our way to a clean energy renewable future is to kind of make the most of what the government programs have. So we partner with them to just do what we can to educate churches on how to make the most of that.
Okay.
So you've spoken about the importance of government to deal with the scale of this problem. I fully agree with you on that, but I also agree with the sense of despair given the change in the House leadership that we're facing right now in Congress. But let me ask you another question of scale. That would be corporations right now. First of all, what is your evaluation of the hope for corporations, not all to be sure, but others significantly leading the way on transition, let's say, to EVs and a more energy conserving way of doing business. And here in Florida, we're facing, of course, the governor's attack on ESG investing, and I'm wondering whether the church has a role in trying to encourage ESG, environmentally friendly investing in corporations, and might make that be a message to take to so many retirees here too, in that much of that might come through retirement funds and pension funds.
Yeah, no, that's a great issue. I think there's any number of good places to focus attention on today. Right now, I happen to be on a task force with United Church Funds, which is the institutional investing arm for the United Church of Christ. It's separate from the United Church of Christ, but a lot of churches will invest their endowments through them. And so we talk about things like ESGs and there's a lot of talk, especially in the UN recently, about net zero goals and so forth. And that align with net zero goals. I think one thing that I'll just to say from a climate justice perspective is that there are some, I think, some tricky issues to work through at times in thinking about these things. That, you know, the United Church Funds is going to be coming out with a climate justice kind of mission statement. And like a lot of justice-related mission statements, kind of the first thing is listening and learning from those on the front lines of the crisis. Those we call sometimes fence line communities, like those communities I referenced in Houston, right? And that's can be challenging, I'll say, because you're going to find voices that will say that ESGs are a form of greenwashing, or that climate net zero goals are a form of greenwashing. And you have to look into and listen closely, why is this environmental justice organization saying that? You know, and think about it, if you are in a frontline community, is what's being proposed going to stop the pollution in my community, right? And so that's kind of where they're coming from. And so if a measure isn't going to stop the pollution that they're experiencing, their children are experiencing every day, it doesn't seem to carry much weight, right? And so you have to kind of listen closely and engage those things. And so I think that's important. It's not to say that we shouldn't be engaging ESGs and net zero goals, but I do think it's an important part of it. I think an especially important part is to think through the issue of just transition, what it means to have a just transition. And that's, for example, something that for a while environmental justice organizations were saying was missing from some corporations' net zero goals, is that these goals weren't incorporating anything that would be just for the transition for their community. And so now the United Nations has kind of come out with a statement saying that you know it's got to be incorporated into every kind of net zero goal, or else it's be considered greenwashing. And so that's just to say some things, but I do think it's a really important place to put energy as well.
I don't think you have to run all the way through.
I can do it.
You've mentioned a few webcasts. Are they open to be listened to later? You've referenced several in your talk. Do you want to listen to any of those?
Yeah, so we actually have a channel where we post on YouTube where we post all of our webinars after they've been done. So you'll find there, the most recent one we did with Interfaith Power Line is on Interfaith Power Line's website, but our YouTube page. But yeah, all of them are on there.
So at a grassroots level, over the years, we've been told there's all these different ways to participate, these different ways to communicate. Used to be letter writing, used to be, you know, again, as you mentioned, postcards, there's online petitions, there's emails, there's all these different ways, rallies, walking, you know, doing group presentations, etc. But which are really effective? Pros and cons to the effectiveness of different communication methods to actually make a difference?
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, I think there's a couple of ways to address that. First is, you know, those who have kind of worked in offices for members of Congress, they'll always kind of rank the communications that they receive, and basically it kind of reflects the amount of effort that went into it. So that anybody can do kind of click on an online action alert or a petition. That doesn't take a lot of energy, so it's not going to really register much. And in fact, there's some people that have worked in congressional office that view that as kind of a fairy tale strategy. It's you know, it's not. But I do think there can be some benefits to doing that. But then kind of the next level is, okay, say a handwritten note, or a note that has been, you know, isn't just a standard message that, you know, is a template everybody's using, but is the real voice, so that they can see, oh, people are giving this thought and attention. And kind of a postcard is that, it's kind of that next level of, you know, the more personalized it is, the better. Phone calls are also very, very good. You're not going to necessarily get a member of the office on the line, somebody can leave a message, and those things are counted and are impactful. I think showing up in person is big. And this is where I would say that it's also important to think not just about kind of the person, elected official that you're, targeting, but actually to think about the public. So in communities where maybe the elected official is not a climate champion, we kind of know from theories of change that, and you can think this out through kind of in very recent times, that public action becomes the catalyst for change. That when public action takes place, it creates a public conversation, which changes public opinion, which then changes how people's voting behavior. And you can see this on movements from both the left and the right, from the civil rights movement to the Tea Party movement, from the marriage equality movement, and so forth. In each of those instances, you see public action becoming the catalyst that ultimately leads to voting behavior, and when voting behavior changes, then policies change. And so that's why I definitely put an emphasis on looking for ways to take public action and knowing that part of the audience isn't the elected official, but is the public, so that you're generating those conversations. Because as we've seen, just in recent times, it has really, changed how people vote.
Other questions? I have one, Brooks. I'm curious about what prompted you to pursue environmental justice as part of your ministry.
Yeah, for me, I think, I was actually telling this panel right over here, but I guess I'll add another part too. So, first it was kind of an intellectual thing almost, in a sense. I was reading a lot about climate change in the newspaper, say back in the year, 2002 or back then, and became more and more aware. So I called up, the Department of Environmental Quality for the state of Washington. I asked, what's the largest source of carbon emissions in the state? They told me it was the state's only coal plant. I then called up the Sierra Club. I said, is there anything being done about it? And they said, well, actually, we're just now launching a campaign to close down the coal plant. And they're in a race with Oregon to become the first coal-free state in the nation. Oregon actually beat out Washington in that one, but both were successful campaigns. But that was kind of my beginning part, was on that level. But actually, as soon as I kind of really dived into that coal plant, it was around the time, where my wife and I had our first child on the way, and I began to read about the health impacts of the coal plant and mercury pollution, and how that can impair the neurological functions of babies. And I think from that point onwards, when I began to learn those things, and as I became a parent, everything really, the fundamental driver was my love for my children. And that continues to be the case. I want for them to inherit the best possible world. And so for me, that's kind of the motivation ultimately for why I stated.
As a follow-up, how does your sense of call play into this?
Yeah, I think for me, I always understand my sense of calling as being rooted in love. And I think, it's love of children, but I think, in terms of Christian terms, I think it's also love of neighbor and love of the natural world around us. I think those are also kind of really definitely driving factors. I mean, when you look at how people are impacted by a climate disaster and you respond to it, from a place of care and compassion, that's a call of love. And so that's, I think, definitely part of it.
I have two questions. One was the last name of this Andy. I think that's the gentleman you said is in Naples. And maybe we could get him up here It's a job sometime too. And the other one is, do church groups have to worry about our tax exempt status if we get involved in any kind of lobbying?
Yeah, well, first the easy one, Wells Bean is his last name, so it's a hyphenated last name, WELLS BEAN. And yeah, definitely invite him. He's got a lot of great knowledge. Yeah, as far as the tax exempt status for churches, that's really only a concern if someone takes a side and supporting a candidate in an election, right? So other than that, I would encourage you to take action and be advocates and so forth. And churches can even be in favor of a proposition on a ballot. But I think in general, the main thing is don't let anything stop you from being an advocate. Just don't. As long as Wes doesn't, endorse a candidate from the pulpit, I think you're okay.
Any more questions? Okay.
In terms of changing the rules and regulations for the FDA, is that congregational? Does Congress need to act on that, or is the FDA? I'm sorry. What did I say? EPA. Is it able to do the change itself, or does it need congressional mandate?
Yeah, I think it really at this point it's really about the EPA and the EPA considering what is going to be kind of its standards for these rules. And so that's really about focusing on the Biden administration, the EPA being under the Biden administration, and the EPA. Now, I'm not a policy wonk or expert in some regards, but yes, there are things Congress can do to make things less conducive to doing the right thing. But I think right now the focus is on getting the EPA to set the right standards.
Can you say more about the postcard campaign?
Yeah. So just to give you a little background on it, the first phase of this kind of year-long effort was to do an art contest for children and youth. And so we had over 900 art submissions come in from 44 different states, and which was great because it's a very intentional strategy. We wanted blue, red, and purple states involved. So we wanted to get as many states involved as possible. And so we had a great art ceremony online. It was very uplifting. We showed 47 finalists. And I thought it was just going to be the parents, but I think we had more than parents join. We had a nice audience, and tremendously uplifting to see the art. So that's on YouTube if you want to check that out and be inspired. But we took the winning art from that, and now we're in the process of creating, the language to put on the back of the postcard that will be allowing for, personalized comments to have more impact, and then it will be addressing the EPA. The winning art will be on the one side. One of the ways in which we'll be using that is not only to deliver something to Washington, D.C., at the end of the campaign, but also will be kind of, I hesitate to say this because I know that this can be, we get a lot of spam these days, but we'll be collecting email addresses for the sole purpose of allowing and encouraging and giving people the direction to how they can make a comment directly to the EPA, because that's very effective to go through the actual EPA channels for making comments, and we'll time it so that there are rules that can be commented on at that time. And so that will be part of the process, and then we want to do a public facing drop off to when we take physical postcards to Washington D.C. in the early. Other things to mention We're grateful that the UCC as a denomination devoted last Giving Tuesday to raising funds and for climate justice work. And so some of those funds will be used so that there's at least 12 climate justice fellows, young adult youth fellows throughout the country this summer that will be collecting postcards in churches and farmers markets and so forth. And so I once learned from one of the leaders in the United Farm Workers that college campuses are one of the best places to do petitions. And so the United Farm Workers used to know that Harvard Square was the place to go. And so maybe locally you've got a campus there to go to. Yeah, so that we'll have some youth and young adults out there, but we want church members throughout the country. Really anybody can go out and collect postcards. A great way to be in touch with your neighbors and to let them know that you're from a church community or where you're from that cares about this. And so, as I always say, as Christians in particular, we're called to go beyond the walls of the church as disciples, and I think this is the way to do that and have an impact. I'm trying to think there's other details to mention.
How do we get postcards?
Well, basically, if you're not already connected with either my newsletter or directly with Andy Wells Bean, give me your email address, and we'll make sure that they'll definitely be in our newsletter. Andy Wells Bean is in contact with everybody who kind of registered via the art contest, but he's got a growing list of people, and so when we have the postcards, printed and ready, we're kind of going through the final stages, working with another organization that's doing a larger EPA. They're leading the coalition-wide campaign addressing the EPA. So we just want to make sure everything is as it should be before we print things off. And so once they're printed off, Andy will be circulating kind of a postcard calculator sheet to think through, okay, how many postcards should we be ordering? Given the size of our congregation, given our location, and so forth. And so, you put in an order for X number of postcards, and we'll ship you those postcards.
With the Supreme Court decision on Citizens United and the subsequent amount of dark money that went into politics, it seems like the influence of the conservative movement has become so much greater than any movement by social and environmental justice groups. How do we fight that tremendous amount of money?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, and so I think the place where often people go to is the side that's kind of driving the damage is got the money, but we've got the people power, right? And I think that's why actually the topic of today is appropriate, because if people are to utilize their full power, they first have to have a hope and a sense of belief that their power will be effective, right? And so I think we kind of know from history that this is often how movements work. Movements usually aren't on the side of money, right? But they have the people, and so that's why the focus goes on how do we best organize people. And I think that's when I think just certain things that may be boring in a sense for a talk, but are very important, that are organizing strategies that are like organize things in a campaign. This is kind of where I often think is the first lesson, because if you just have a general kind of approach to an issue, energy soon dissipates, fizzles out. The nice thing about campaign is the thing that defines it as an end deadline, right? So you're building up to something, you're rallying people's energy around something, and then there's a built-in rest after it, right? be another campaign, but at least you have some time to kind of reflect and regroup, you know. And so I always encourage, you know, churches or any organization, you want to think, what can we do that we can organize into a campaign? If you think about how churches organize themselves for really important things, like raising money for a leaky roof or whatever the case, they conduct a capital campaign, right? And so when things are important, that we organize as a campaign. And so I think that's a, you know, just an important lesson. That's how we maximize our people power.
You have mentioned the EPA as the go-to place. We know that in the former administration, the EPA the power was greatly reduced, the authority, the support of the environment. What is your assessment of the EPA in the Biden administration?
I'd say great. Yeah, I mean, you know, so there's no doubt that, I mean, we're, you know, I think I don't know if the complete autopsy has been done yet on what happened in Ohio, but I mean, undoubtedly, you know, that's an instance in which we want better rules and regulations, and there were some things that were taken away in the last administration related to what happened, whether or not it's the cost, I haven't maybe read deeply enough into that, but I think, you know, we're still dealing with the effects of the repeal of over 100 rules and regulations from the last administration. But with this administration, you know, and this is, I think, also a point of UCC pride, that when we celebrated a few months ago the 40th anniversary of that 6-week civil disobedience campaign in Warren County, North Carolina, the head of the EPA went there, and along with Dolly Burwell, and along with Benjamin Chavis, who both spoke at the press conference, he signed in, you know, a document saying that the EPA would, for the first time ever, make environmental justice one of its top priorities, and that wasn't just a statement of you know, just a general, you know, statement of good intentions. It came with real staffing goals, where, you know, we're talking lots of staff would now be devoted to environmental justice, lots of money would now be devoted to environmental justice, and significant amounts, really fundamentally reshaping the EPA. You know, something that's, you know, never been done before. So that's an incredible accomplishment. The EPA now has a lot of money in some regards, especially for environmental justice. Some of the challenges, though, is that over the years, the EPA has been defunded. And so the money that's needed to kind of enforce rules and regulations, that is still missing, or is not where it should be as a result of previous administrations. And so on the one hand, the EPA has a lot of new money, but it doesn't actually have the money it needs to implement its, you know, its past mandates. And so it's a tricky situation, but undoubtedly the present administration has really, I think, done great things in the situation that it's faced. And the EPA also has, you know, because of the previous administration, has a severe staffing shortage or lack of, you know, because so many people left, right? And so there's some challenges, but undoubtedly the current administration's been doing the right thing, I think.
I have another question.
I apologize, Brooks, this isn't directed to you, it's directed to all the people sitting here, so if you're excited about a postcard campaign or mapping with a friend, the green team for this church meets on the second Thursday at 10 a.m. currently, online and in a hybrid format. It's small but mighty, it always welcomes new members and friends. Let's get it done.
Okay, one last question. Anybody? Oh, okay.
It's not really a question, but it's, have you ever heard of Jane Goodall's book called Hope? Or read it?
I've heard of it, and unfortunately I have not read it.
Okay.
There's way too many books I have not read.
Well, it's
what she has done in various countries with the children to inspire hope in the world for the environment. And it's a lot. So that is a very hopeful book to read.
Sounds like a great book for a church book.
Let's take a 20-minute break. I don't have my watch on, which is